You have to accept that your job may disappear. And you have to take it upon yourself to know where your industry is going and what the future might look like and how you can prepare yourself for that. That's by no means unique to dock workers or manufacturing workers or warehouse workers. You really can't predict that, and you need to be watching for signals about where the next big thing is going to be, what the trends are, and do the best you can. Standardization is really a tough nut to crack. Everybody has their vested interests. Everybody has put money into something that meets their standard. And the idea that you're going to throw that out and adopt somebody else's standard is pretty painful.
Welcome to KPI Fireside. Our mission is simple: to improve companies and to improve careers through continuous improvement. In every episode, we explore the spark, the moment, the mindset, or the method that ignites real change. Whether you're just starting out or leveling up, you'll find the insights and inspiration to fuel your next improvement. Welcome back to KPI Fireside, a continuous improvement podcast. I am your host, Keith Norris. Our guest today is Marc Levinson. Marc is a historian, an economist, and an author whose career has centered on making complex economic issues easily understandable. On his resume, you'll find he formerly served as the finance and economics editor at The Economist. He was an economist at J.P. Morgan Chase and a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He wrote a book titled The Box, which is a history of the shipping container, and this book is what really initiated our interest in having him join us on the podcast today. Marc, welcome to the podcast.
Keith, it's great to be with you.
Yeah, it's such kind of an interesting story how I came across your book. I was doing it was either Google searches or like some AI stuff about examples of innovation. You know, AI is like everything right now, and AI is this like huge innovation threat, you might say. And so I was kind of looking for some analogies of different technologies, and up popped this thing about the shipping container. And I'm like, oh, that's an interesting one. Shipping containers are everywhere. And then I ended up coming across your book, and I downloaded the audiobook and I started listening to it. And I'm like, man, this guy knows more than anybody could possibly ever know about the history of the shipping container. So I wanted to invite you to the show. What caused you to say, I need to write this history of the shipping container?
My interest is international trade and international economics. That's a subject on which I've worked for many years. And so I came to the shipping container from that perspective. I'm not a maritime person. I'm not an expert in ships and did not approach it from that side at all. It was my feeling that a lot of the discussion about the rather dramatic increase that we had in international trade starting in the 1980s, the creation of these new supply chains, really assigned a dominant role to the government. Okay, they assumed that it was tariff reductions that led to this boom in international trade. And there were certainly a lot of tariff reductions. But I felt that the discussion had really missed the role of the private sector here, and in particular, the role of reduced transportation costs. And so that's what got me into the container. I had previously worked at what was then a daily newspaper, the Journal of Commerce, as the editorial director, and so I was somewhat familiar with the maritime industry, but I approached this issue very much from the international trade perspective.
So interesting. I want to give our listeners some pieces of this story that they can, kind of sink their teeth into, and maybe a bit of an education. So I'm going to try to ask you some questions of things that I took out of the book. I mean, there's so much to it. We can't possibly get into all of it, but there's some things that I thought were really interesting. And then I want to try to kind of weave this into a lot of problems that everybody's dealing with today, not just in AI, but, like you said, logistics. The audience here, a lot of us work in process improvement, high volume processes. So there's so many interesting analogies, both direct and indirect here. So could you maybe start with just what was the current state of how shipping worked before the shipping container, like the ports and the longshoremen and that kind of stuff?
Sure. We're going back now into the early 1950s, and shipping, ocean shipping at least, was a very, very inefficient business. Just to give you an example, if someone say a factory in Indiana, wanted to export something to Europe. Okay, there would be a team of carpenters at the factory that would build a crate, a customized crate for this product. And then they would put it in the back of a truck, or they would put it in a box car that was pulled up at a siding alongside the factory, or the truck might take it to the railroad and then would have to remove the crate and put it into a box car somewhere else. It would end up at a port. The crate would have to be removed from the train or the truck, put onto the pier. The records would have to be kept, and then it would be taken into a warehouse. When the ship finally arrived, it would be removed from the warehouse back onto the pier. Then it would have to be lifted by a winch into the ship, and then longshore workers would have to shove it into place. So this particular product, this single item that emerged from this factory, had to be handled repeatedly, time and time again, and the same at the other end of the voyage. So it could easily take a couple of months to export this engine or water pump or whatever it happened to be to a customer in Europe. It was a slow process. It was very expensive because there was so much labor involved in handling this cargo. And in my view, that really restrained international trade. There were a lot of goods that just were not traded internationally because it was very expensive to trade them. And transportation costs were, you could think of them as a barrier to trade, just in the same way tariffs are. So that was the situation. You had lots and lots of men, and they were almost all men, working on the docks in major ports, on the order of 50,000 in New York City in the early 1950s, a similar number in London, tens of thousands in other major ports. And they lived in waterfront communities, usually somewhere near the port. And they had work that usually paid pretty well when there was work, but it was very irregular work. They had to go to the docks in the morning and hope that a ship had come in and that there was a demand for labor. And if there were ships that had come in, well, many of the men got work that day. And if there were no ships that came in, there was no work. So it was a whole culture, really, that was built around the longshoremen, as they're called in the States, who loaded and unloaded these vessels. The ships were old. They were small. The ships were mostly left over from World War II. They didn't carry very much cargo. And the volume of international trade was really quite small. And so that's what the world looked like at the start of containerization. The typical form of shipping was what was known as break bulk shipping. And what break bulk meant was that each item was handled separately and was handled again and again. And the reason the container came about, really, was that there was a lot of interest in making shipping more efficient, but no one had found a way to make this financially viable. There had been many experiments with containers on railroads and on ship lines, and they hadn't worked out. To give you an example, a number of U.S. railroads used containers during the 1920s. So it was not a new idea to put the freight in containers, but they wanted to keep that business for themselves. And so the railroads used a container that would only fit onto their equipment. You couldn't take a Pennsylvania Railroad container and put it onto a Missouri Pacific train. And of course, the result of that was that shipping freight in containers just wasn't very popular. If you put your freight into a container, you could put it aboard a ship and carry it somewhere else. But then what did you do with the container? Okay, either it could be melted down or it could be shipped back empty or something, but it was not an efficient way. So that's why the idea of the container had been around for a very long time, but it had never really taken off.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting lines that I think comes up again and again in your book, is how a shift in the process, you might say, in the supply chain in one place creates another opportunity. You mentioned the longshoremen and how, before this innovation, so much of the work was centered around the ports. And then as the containers were not just unloaded at the ports, they were quickly moved further away from the ports. And so you make the point about the jobs, how the jobs, basically left in a lot of cases, not just because there wasn't as many there, but there was more opportunities in other places. Maybe you could talk about that. That is how innovation changes opportunity.
Well, it really changed economic geography in a lot of ways. It was typical in the pre-container era for big factories to be very close to the docks. That way the factories could get their inputs in and they could get their finished products out very, very easily. And so if you went to Brooklyn, for example, was one of the great manufacturing centers of the United States. Why? It had all these piers, and the factories wanted to be right there. London, East London, was a huge manufacturing center for much the same reason. Well, once you had the container, then there was not a lot of need to have a factory by the docks. Many of the factories near the docks were outmoded. They were several stories because land was very expensive in that area. Why be there when you could work just as efficiently out in a rural place where land was a lot cheaper and have the trucks carry the containers to the port? And that's what happened. So you saw a lot of the industries that had been in Brooklyn, for example, move out to Pennsylvania or further out in New Jersey. In London, you had very much the same experience. The big factories that were near the docks closed down just as the docks closed down, and they moved elsewhere. So it really made a great change in where jobs are located, where factories are located. And the need for giant factories that made really everything, vertically integrated factories, as they say, that kind of went away because you could move goods very cheaply between factories. So you no longer needed to do the sort of thing that Henry Ford did at the River Rouge, where, you brought in iron ore and you brought in rubber and you made everything from tires and wheels and windshields to a finished car in the same place. No reason to do that anymore. You could spread it out. You could put each input, make it in a different place, and bring them all together pretty inexpensively with container freight. And so that really changed the way that manufacturing worked.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And again, everything always looks so simple in hindsight. Like, of course, the shipping container, what a simple idea. But I think your book does a great job of really showing how even some of the simplest good ideas in that innovation really took a long time to happen. One of those that you mentioned a little bit that I'll ask you a little bit about is just the size of the container. Tell us a little bit about what's the right size for containers, how that was not such an easy problem to solve.
Yeah, this was a tough problem. The first containers that Malcolm McLean used were 33 feet long. And the reason for that was that at that time, that was the maximum size container that could be transported on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, which was a road that led to the dock at Newark, New Jersey, where McLean's ships were. And so he used 33-foot containers. And then as the law changed, he went up to 35-foot containers. There were other U.S. ship lines that started using containers. There was a company called Matson, still in business out in the Pacific, that they sailed between California and Hawaii. They did all kinds of detailed studies and determined that for their purposes, a 24-foot long container would be best. Another line, Grace Line, went to Venezuela. They thought they would try putting containers on, but they thought a 17-foot container would be best for their service, which eventually never got started. So every company was looking at the container, but they were looking at what was best for their business. This was a concern to the U.S. military. Most of the ships that were in domestic trade in the United States had been built with government assistance, government loans, and that sort of thing. And part of the deal was that in the event of a national emergency, the U.S. military could call on those ships. And so the military people started asking, what are we supposed to do in the event of war? Okay, you've got some 35-foot containers here, and you've got some 24-foot containers, and you've got some 17-foot containers. And how do we fight a war like that? What kind of ship are we going to have that's going to fit all those containers? And basically, the military told the ship lines and the railroads and the truckers and the container manufacturers, look, we need some kind of standard for the container. You guys get together, you find a standard. If you don't do it, we'll do it for you. And that really triggered years of discussion. I tell people these are the real heroes of the container story, the engineers from all of these different companies who spent years sitting around conference tables in smoke-filled hotel rooms talking about things like, well, how many internal supports should there be at the container? How should the doors open? How long should it be? How wide should it be? How thick should the steel be? Think of all of the different construction details. Each of these has cost implications, okay? If you're going to make the steel thicker, it's going to cost more to
Way
buy a
more.
container. So all of this stuff had to be debated, and it was debated for 4 or 5 years. And then there were foreign interests who said, we hope we're going to have the container here. Maybe we should do this internationally. And so the negotiations went to the International Organization for Standardization. And now the Japanese and most of the Europeans and a few others were involved in trying to reach an international agreement on the same things. And it took 10 years. They really hammered all of these details out. And you can see why if you think about some of the complications. For example, inside a container today, there are strong metal supports. Okay. Well, how many of those should there be? Were they necessary? Back in the early days, the answer from the ship lines was yes, because we'd like to be able to stack containers. The answer from people in the trucking industry was no. Okay, because they were only going to haul one container at a time. They weren't going to stack containers. So why did they want something that was going to raise the cost of a container? So every party who was engaged in this had their own economic interests. Eventually, it took Malcolm McLean coming back into the story. He was not involved with the negotiations. He had invented, or his team had invented a device that locked containers together, and a standard for the steel fittings that are used in every corner of a container. They all had a hole in them that you could put this device into, so you could connect a couple of containers or lift them with a crane. Every ship line had its own containers, and they had their own proprietary design for the corner fitting. And McLean basically said, use mine. He gave away his patent, his technology. So every container that was built then could use the same corner fitting and was the same size. And that meant that it could be lifted in any port or any rail yard anywhere in the world. So the standard setting process took forever. It was really painful. But when they agreed on a standard container, then that really opened the way to a boom in container shipping.
Yeah, I remember part of the story was the military role, and was it the Korean War that you wrote a lot about? How is it the Connex containers that the military? A lot of folks in the military would be familiar with those as a certain size, and how those factors in the evolution of the sizing and whatnot.
The military had its Connex with containers, which were much smaller boxes than the standard container. They'd use those during the Korean War. But really, the considerations here were heavily commercial. Everyone agreed that there should be a standard. Everybody thought that the kind of container they used for their businesses should be the standard. Okay, so let's do this, but let's do it our way.
Yeah.
And this is what was a huge obstacle. And this, by the way, as I'm sure your listeners know, remains a big issue today. Standardization is really a tough nut to crack. Everybody has their vested interests. Everybody has put money into something that meets their standard. And the idea that you're going to throw that out and adopt somebody else's standard is pretty painful.
I think that's one of the great lessons in the book is that standardization process and what they went through and how they got there and the trade-offs they had to make.
Well, one of the lessons for me here is that it worked because there was a lot of pressure. And again, the U.S. government wasn't involved in setting the standard. The U.S. government was involved in making a threat, which is you guys set the standard and get it done. Okay. Right now, there's a lot of discussion about standards for different things, many of them in the technology realm, but you don't have this threat looming. You don't have somebody warning people of all of the bad things that might happen if they don't reach agreement on a standard. So the discussions can go on for quite a while. And I think it was very helpful in the container area to have the U.S. government say, just agree on something. We don't know what it should be. You guys do. You guys agree. That's an unusual way to force the private sector to agree on something, but it worked in the case of the container.
Yeah, that is an interesting one. I think you talked about on this topic of standards, like the width of railroad lines. Like I probably take for granted that railroad tracks are what railroad tracks are, but you told a few examples of how that's not a simple one either.
Well, the railroad tracks were standardized in this country mostly in the late 1800s. And in that case, it really happened because some railroads bought up others, and then they just moved their tracks so they could send their trains straight through. This is ancient history at this point, but you had various gauges on railroads in the United States, and in other countries too, you still do at times. And it's a complicated process to get everybody on the same standards. Absolutely. If you had to do the container standardization today, would it be so easy? I'm not sure, because you'd have a lot more parties involved. You'd have a lot more countries that wanted to be at the table. It would be a lot more complicated.
So interesting. If anybody is like me and you've got a box somewhere in your house filled with phone and computer chargers that you have no idea what they fit, it's a version of this type of standardization problem that we tend to all face. That's so interesting. Are you struggling to ignite real change in your continuous improvement program? Firestarter is your field guide. Real stories, proven strategies, no fluff. Get it now on Amazon. So as an economist looking at this, there's probably some lessons in there that, they did these. You look at them as little experiments. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Sometimes you want to repeat it, sometimes you don't. What would you say are some of the lessons that are learned from this innovation, this transition, that might be applicable with some of the innovations we have in front of us?
Well, there are a lot of them for sure. I think the economic impact of the container was wildly different from what people anticipated. Just unpredictable, to be sure, but I cite this study done by a pretty well-known Harvard University economist in the late 1950s, who forecast that the shipping container was actually going to be great for the garment industry in New York City. Of course, the garment industry was the big manufacturing industry in New York, roughly 1 million people engaged in it. And he says it's going to be great because it's going to be cheaper to get your garments down to the South and you can sell more of them. It hadn't remotely occurred to him that it would also be great at bringing garments in from Asia, manufactured at much lower cost, and would actually put an end to the garment district in New York. Okay, so just one example of many that the impact of the container was just totally missed. I think one of the things that is really important that I take away is how long it took to make the adjustments after container shipping came into being. Economists can be kind of blithe about this and say people will adjust to economic change. And that's true, they do. But if you take a look at a place like Brooklyn, the employment in industry and the employment in transportation started plummeting in the 1960s, and it was not until the 1990s that the economy started reviving. So yes, Brooklyn revived, the Brooklyn economy was transformed, but it was not a quick process. And during those intervening years, this was a tough place to live. There were a lot of people who were stuck in Brooklyn where there were no jobs and they couldn't get out, and there was not much attractive to bring employment into the borough. So I think we need to be not too dismissive when people say, well, what's going to happen to our town? You can't just say, you'll adjust, because the adjustment process can be very long and painful. And perhaps we need to think a bit about how the government can help with these adjustments that come from economic change.
Do you have any insights or advice on that subject? Because we're staring down the tunnel at a lot of innovation coming our way with AI. I guess let me ask you another question here. You can pick up either one of these, but when you look back on the container story, who were the winners in that story, and what behaviors might us as individuals try to model from, like, the people that were successful during that versus the people that were maybe, not the winners in that story?
The winners and losers are hard to sort out. Many of the ship lines, for example, ended up as losers, which may be contrary to what you might think. Okay, after all, the ship lines were saving money, right? But playing in the container area required huge amounts of capital. And many of these companies didn't have it. Some companies did have it, but they bought the wrong kind of ship. They gambled on a certain route or a certain size or whatever it was, and they were done for. So ship lines, by and large, were big losers. There are a few survivors who did very well, but it's interesting that many of the companies that are now the most prosperous in container shipping were late to the party. They were not pioneers. Maersk Line got into container shipping in the early 70s. Mediterranean Shipping, which is now the largest container shipping company in the world, it didn't even exist back then. It was a startup. CMA CGM, the French line, partially took over a traditional French ship line, partially was a new company, again, founded by people whose background was not in shipping and was, again, late to the party. Evergreen Line in Taiwan, same story. So the leaders, the people who were the pioneers, were generally not the ones who made money out of this. The ones who made money out of this were people who had very sharp pencils, and they looked what was going on in the shipping industry and said, we can come into this and we can do it better. And we're not burdened by traditional thinking about how to run a ship line. And so a lot of those people have done very well in the container shipping industry, while a lot of the longtime players are out of business. Many of the companies that have done well are companies that made specialized products that previously had not been in demand, but there was a need for them with container shipping. And there's still companies doing that. For example, making systems to monitor containers while they're in transit. There's a lot of interest today in smart containers, which involves putting a digital device on the container to keep track of whether the door's been opened and what the internal temperature has been and how many times it's been jostled and whatever else you want. There's specialized companies that make those specialized parts, and they can make some money. And there are a lot of examples of those sorts of things. Products that were ancillary to the container, but were not there at the beginning. There are certainly companies that made a lot of money by redesigning their supply chains. They learned to take advantage of the container. And that proved to be a very profitable venture for many firms. There's an entire industry that didn't exist before, the logistics industry. These people not only do freight forwarding, which is basically booking the cargo on a ship, but they will arrange the entire transportation of cargo from end to end. They may store it. They will own distribution centers or other kinds of warehouses to store the cargo. They'll keep track of it. They'll provide information about it. They may operate fleets of trucks that they themselves own. In some cases, they operate vessels that they own. And that's an industry which was not a presence before container shipping. So all kinds of people have found ways to change their businesses or to create new businesses to take advantage of the new economics.
I think that's such a good point, and I probably tend to be more of an optimist than a pessimist on most things. I find that's just a more enjoyable place to live my life, I guess you could say. And I think the point there that, yes, there's a lot of longshoremen from the 1950s that didn't have work, but there probably were a lot of companies, maybe the person that built the crane was a former longshoreman who saw an opportunity to, entire new industries, like the jobs that were created from that shift. Like when things move, there tends to be a lot of opportunities for people that can take advantage of the knowledge that they had about that problem space and see how to move things forward. Malcolm McLean was definitely a character in this story, and he had a lot of big bets. I mean, I kind of think of him as like, almost like a Steve Jobs sort of character, where he had some real wins and then he had some real losses and then some real wins, and he had a string of wins and then, kind of some big losses. There's some other characters in our culture right now, like Elon Musk, who are like on a string of wins. What happened to Malcolm McLean? What were some of his big bets, and how did his story turn out?
Well, McLean had started out, of course, betting on the trucking industry, and he'd built this company, which he had to sell in order to get into the ocean shipping business. Regulators would not allow him to do both. So he built his company. It became known as Sea Land Service. It was the largest container ship line for a while. And once international shipping started, a lot of people wanted into this industry. They saw this as a growth industry, as a booming industry. They didn't really realize that shipping is just a commodity. Okay, you don't really have a product that you can charge a premium for because you really can't charge more than the other guy. So it was not like having a Xerox machine or a Polaroid camera or the other kinds of products that people were comparing it to in the 1960s. It was selling a commodity, space aboard a ship. McLean got an offer, and so he decided to sell his company. He sold it to a tobacco company. The tobacco company was making a lot of money off of cigarettes, and it wanted to do something, so it decided to get in on this go-go industry. So it lost a good bit of money in container shipping, and McLean certainly didn't like working for them. as a board member. So eventually they sold it and McLean got out of it. He didn't want to be out of the game, though. He loved being in the game. That was his thing. He was one of these people. He's not, not avaricious. He was not determined to be the first trillionaire in the world, but he competed and he wanted to win. That's what he really lived for. So he decided to buy United States Lines, which was the biggest shipping line of any sort based in the United States. And it operated old break bulk ships, and it operated some container ships and some passenger ships and different kinds of things. And he was going to straighten this out. At U.S. Lines, they placed an order at his direction for some efficient new ships that were going to provide a high-speed round-the-world service. Well, it turned out that round-the-world service was not a great product because just from the natural flow of commerce, there were some legs of the service that were very heavily loaded, and there were some that were not. And having very fast ships meant that they were very fuel wasting. They burned a lot of oil. So he lost a lot of money on these ships, and the United States Lines went into bankruptcy in the 1980s. McLean had taken his big bet and lost, and he was quite ashamed of this. Not because of personal disgrace, but because he felt a real responsibility to the people who worked for him, and he felt like he had not done well by them. All of these people were laid off in what was at the time the biggest bankruptcy in U.S. history. So he was on the sidelines for a while, keeping a low profile, but he was a guy who couldn't sit still. So in the 1990s, he got back into the business. He helped start a little barge line that was carrying freight between Florida and Puerto Rico. It's still in business. He just wanted to be in the game, wanted to be doing something, wanting to build a success. And he was active in doing that until the day he died. He was in his 80s. When he bought U.S. Lines, he was probably in his 70s, late 60s, 70s. When he started the barge business, he was in his 80s. He wanted to be active. He wanted to be engaged. And he kept coming up with ideas. Here's something that other people aren't doing, and maybe we can make a success of it. Let's try it. He was a big believer in that.
I really like the story of Malcolm McLean and what you said about him. I don't know the guy. I've had some interactions with the logistics industry, and now I'm starting to see some connections and patterns in how some of these names that I became familiar with, just the stories and how some of them tied back to the beginning. So I found it was such an interesting read and listen on the history of something that we've all seen, but probably not really thought that much about unless you're in that industry. So really, really great book that you wrote there. I really appreciate you. You must have put hundreds of hours into the research and gathering all of the information that went into it. It's very, very deep.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed writing it. And I've been quite amazed over the years by the public response to it. When the book was published by Princeton University Press, which sends the manuscripts out to scholars for a reading and a recommendation, should we publish this book? And one of the scholars, I don't know who it was, who read the book, came back with a comment that all of this stuff about standardization is boring. Probably you should get it out of the book. I didn't. The press went ahead and published that chapter with the rest of the book. And it's fascinating to me how interesting this is to people today. It seems still extremely relevant to the sorts of issues that people face today in the 2020s.
Yeah, if you're somebody listening that has ever found yourself watching a documentary or something on the History Channel about something and be like, I had no idea I was interested in this, I would definitely recommend it, because that was kind of my experience. Is like, wow, this there's some really and so many lessons of the entrepreneur, taking a chance and keep swinging at things. Like the economic shifts that we're all facing with AI right now. Like, hey, there's so many lessons from history where these same patterns have repeated, and if you can see some of these lessons, you might be better prepared for what to do in the future. I'm curious, from your perspective and based on what you've written about and what what kind of advice could you give to somebody who is a longshoreman today, let's say working in one of these areas that's set to be disrupted by AI, what could they learn from the lessons that you've written about and that you've learned, and how they could improve their own prospects for the future?
I don't really think that I have any uniquely clever advice to give. I think this is true for almost any person in any job today. You have to accept that your job may disappear, and you have to take it upon yourself to know where your industry is going and what the future might look like and how you can prepare yourself for that. That's by no means unique to dock workers or manufacturing workers or warehouse workers. You really can't predict that, and you need to be watching for signals about where the next big thing is going to be, what the trends are. And do the best you can. I think pretty much everybody agrees that the idea that you pick a career when you reach 20 and you spend the rest of your life in that career is pretty much gone. And you have to take some responsibility, hard as it may be, for coping with change as it comes.
How about advice for policymakers and government type authorities who actually are in positions to make decisions that can affect a lot of people? What is your advice or perspective for those folks?
I would say that the switch to container shipping was a lot easier for Europe than for the United States. And the reason was that in much of Europe, there were better labor protections. It doesn't mean people kept their jobs. It meant people had continuing income for a while. And so when their jobs on their dock disappeared, they weren't just getting a goodbye. Okay, they were immediately offered retraining. They were offered a cash package to help them with the transition. And so there was not quite so much anxiety that the bottom would fall out. Those also tend to be countries, obviously, where the labor movement has a much bigger say in government policy. And I think that was really important. In the United States, people were rightly concerned that they would lose their jobs and they would have nothing. And that really slowed and continues to slow the transition to mechanization.
That's an interesting tie-in that you just mentioned. So a lot of the folks that we work with are involved in this Lean Six Sigma discipline and this idea of respect for people and driving process improvement. And one of the foundations of this is, if you're working inside of an organization and you make a process improvement that frees up labor, the worst thing you can do is terminate people, because that really, it kills your incentive to continue to innovate and move forward. And I think that's part of what I'm picking up on that story there is, if you have some labor protections, like, okay, let's go ahead, let's innovate these jobs and we'll figure out what the next job is for you. I know that there's a lot of pessimism around, like, the jobs are going away or that the jobs change, but I think the lesson that I've seen repeated a lot is that the jobs just change, and a lot of these innovations create so many more jobs than we ever could have thought were going to be there. They're just different than the ones that are today. So I don't know how you feel about that perspective as an economist, but that's how I feel about it as an optimist.
Some of the jobs don't pay as well. Okay, many of the distribution centers out in California, for example, pay not terrific wages. The workers have no union representation. It's not as good a job as a job on the docks would be if you could have a job on the docks. But you do have to, I think it's humane to help people find their way to something else and not just, say goodbye and thank you for all your efforts and here's 2 weeks' pay. This is, I think, going to be a political issue with AI because it's created a sense of instability. The thing that I think was unique to the longshore labor situation, and not just in the United States, was that this working on the docks had been a family business, and the people who did it typically lived in pretty tight-knit communities near the docks. So this was a case not just of eliminating jobs, but of really ripping apart a community, and that made it much more difficult, I think, to accept that the day when they needed thousands and thousands of workers on the docks was gone.
I'm curious, you mentioned this, how things were different in Europe versus in the US with labor protections. I want to ask you to drill down on that a little bit. Like, what are some actual tactics that whether it's governments or companies could do with this sort of innovation or should do based on, what you've seen or the lessons that you've learned?
There are countries that have a combination of benefits for people who've lost their jobs and training requirements. Okay. So, your job is done. We're going to give you a reasonable share of your previous income for a while. But if you want to collect that, you have to demonstrate that you're actually in training for a new career and you have to complete this training. We're not just going to give you a guaranteed income. So it puts some burden on the worker to accept that there's change, to accept that they need to learn to do other things. But it also solves the immediate problem of how am I going to feed my family tonight? And those kind of programs in the United States just have traditionally not been very good.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, as somebody who tends to think more entrepreneurial, there's always a need for a good champion of a good cause. And there's somebody that needs to take that problem up and go fight for it and turn it into a program and figure out how to lobby to get funding for it or to get companies to get funding for it. Cause there's so much change that's happening. And I think that that's a great lesson. I know a lot of companies and government leaders that are thinking about how do we reskill people, how do we get people trained, and for advice for individuals is probably get familiar with the changing technology, get familiar with the stuff that's happening with AI, because the best chance of making it through that coming wave is to be surfing it, I guess, rather than getting buried by it. That's good. Well, Marc, tell us what you got cooking next. I know you got another project that you're working on that we could maybe look forward to.
I have a book coming out in October called The UPS Man. And this is a biography of James E. Casey. Casey is a figure who's not much known today, but he was the man who co-founded a bicycle messenger service in 1907 in the basement of a Seattle saloon and built it into United Parcel Service, one of the biggest transportation companies in the world. And of course, United Parcel Service is really fundamental when you're talking about globalization. Okay, they manage supply chains for lots and lots of companies. It's also been fundamental to the growth of online retailing. So it's really made a huge economic difference. I'd never written a biography before, so I wanted to give it a hand. And Casey had never been the subject of a biography before. So I thought I'd try.
That's awesome. I love it. I'm looking forward to it. I'm sure it'll be a very interesting story.
It's a story that really hasn't been told. United Parcel Service is a very secretive company. It was during the entire time he was involved with it. He was involved with the company for 76 years. And during that entire time, it was a privately held company, which meant that they didn't have to disclose much to anybody. So there is not a whole lot known about this gentleman. And I did some excavation.
Love it. Well, Marc, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing all the wisdom. I'm glad we got a chance to talk a little bit more about the book. For folks that want to follow you or look forward to your next book, what's the best way for folks to follow up with you or connect with you?
I have a website. It's marclevinson.net. It's Marc with a C. And I'm not big on social media, but they can certainly find me on my website. And from time to time, I even post there.
Well, yeah. Thanks again so much. I really appreciate the book, the story, so much interesting stuff there. I took a lot of lessons away from it, made me think about a lot of things in a new way, and just connected a lot of dots that I had no idea were so connected. So it was really, really nice piece of work that you put together.
Well, thank you, Keith. I appreciate you having me on. It's been a fun conversation.
You bet. You bet. For our listeners, if you'd like to suggest a guest, ask a question, or give us any ideas for episodes, you can reach out to me, Keith Norris, on LinkedIn. And this concludes this episode of KPI Fireside, a continuous improvement podcast. If you've enjoyed today's episode, be sure to add a comment. You can like, follow, subscribe on all the socials, and please share the podcast with friends or colleagues who are as passionate about continuous improvement as you are. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. And until next time, keep driving progress and sparking change. This episode is brought to you by KPI Fire, the all-in-one platform for continuous improvement. With KPI Fire, you can align strategy, drive execution, and engage your people. So whether you're leading a team or driving enterprise-wide change, KPI Fire helps you deliver real results. Learn more at www.kpifire.com.